Mark Trammell here with the Center for American Liberty. I'm joined by my good friend and our Center for American Liberty's first client, actually, Andy Ngo. Andy, it's really good to see you.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
So, Andy, I wanted to take just a moment. You are, I think, the world expert on all things Antifa. The Center for American Liberty started representing you back in, I think, 2019, maybe it was 2018, actually, after you were brutally attacked and left with brain hemorrhages after going in these autonomous zones and being identified and being attacked for reporting the truth about what's actually going on with Antifa. So I wanted to talk to you today because obviously Antifa is very much in the news. Earlier this week, President Trump shared his desire to designate Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. And so I really just kind of wanted to get your take on it. And I think myself included, but I think a lot of us have questions. So kind of what are your thoughts on the president's announcement and what does that look like moving forward?
So I saw that there is understandably a lot of excitement online. However, I remember that during the first administration, President Trump also issued a statement on social media at that time proclaiming that his administration would be treating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. And I think what I've learned through all these many years is that because of the legal system in the United States, there actually is not an ability formally for a government to proscribe or ban a domestic organization based on ideology, which is different from, for example, in European countries or in the UK where I am at now, where there aren't First Amendment protections to the same degree as the US. So they can ban certain organizations. For example, a violent extremist Palestinian advocacy organization accused of engaging in attacks on infrastructure in the UK recently was banned by the British government. Something like that couldn't happen in the US. So I think what stood out to me more in that press conference was that he said that he was discussing that they could look at RICO and that he would be speaking with Pam Bondi. Trump is not the legal expert. We have the Department of Justice for that. And I think that federally, there are tools available with the current criminal legislation, RICO, conspiracy charges. In fact, a lot of people don't even know that a Antifa cell was brought down in California, of all places, just 2 years ago in San Diego County. San Diego County, the SoCal Antifa, 12 out of 12 who were accused were convicted, and it went to trial and they were sentenced, and all the evidence went out of the conspiracy to riot between the members, how they planned it, how they talked about what weapons they would bring, who was in the group chat on Signal. It was all exposed. It received no national media attention and very, very little even attention in California media. So there is a framework for how this can be approached. And I hope that people don't get too excited thinking about an executive declaration will somehow mean that now, there are a whole bunch of new tools to go after them. There aren't. The U.S. has this very delicate balance of where First Amendment protections are at the forefront. And the way that Antifa organize is very similar to how radical Islamists organize. So, for example, in the U.S., you can't ban radical Islam. You cannot ban even extremist interpretations and advocacy of Islam. That's protected religious freedom. So how you think of it is Antifa is an ideology. Biden said that before, and he was slammed because it sounded like he was downplaying it, which I think he was. But he also was correct. It is an ideology. It's also a movement. It can organize into networks. There are organized groups. The cells can be a group that's as formalized as Rose City Antifa in Portland, who I sued in my civil case, which I have representation from Cal. But then there are individuals who are radicalized by themselves with the propaganda that's put out online. There are texts and pamphlets on the ground that are distributed at Antifa events and anarchist events, book fairs, radical bookstores. But online, it's also disseminated through very vast networks. So the problem is huge, and it's supported by large apparatus. I'm most known for my reporting and video coverage of the on-the-ground violent militancy, because that has been denied for so long. I wanted to focus on that. But the bigger picture is it's supported by larger concentric circles of allies and fellow co-conspirators, I would argue. You have media who's a part of that concentric circle. You have elected politicians. People ask me a lot, what happened to all the hundreds of riot suspects who were arrested in Portland 5 years ago during the BLM Antifa insurrection? Well, we had a prosecutor who was elected, who came into power in 2020, Mike Schmidt, and he was very vocal about his support for radical leftist politics. So his DA's office, as a matter of policy, chose to immediately ask for to not pursue any of the criminal charges against the overwhelming majority of the riot suspects. So that's part of the picture. You have also then left-wing liberal judges who are sympathetic to the cause of what these riot suspects are doing, and therefore will choose to dismiss the case or choose to sign and approve really absurd sweetheart plea deals. I'm talking about like those who are accused of like multiple counts of felony arson or felony assault being allowed to plead it down to misdemeanor. And then in the state of Oregon, if you don't get in trouble during your probation, you can get that record expunged as long as you pay back the restitution. And Antifa can fundraise that restitution. I saw them do it. $50,000, no problem. So that's what we're dealing with here.
Yeah. Andy, I have so many questions from what you just said, like ridiculous amount of questions. I think the most recent from what you just said is the funding aspect of it. And I think one of the things we're all questioning is, how does this unincorporated organization that's this outgrowth of an ideology, like where does that money come from, right? You hear a lot of people speculating this is George Soros or others, but in your estimation, where does the money come from? When we file a lawsuit against members of Rose City Antifa, they all have money for lawyers and not inexpensive lawyers, right? I mean, these are high paid lawyers. And so how do they find this type of resource?
This is probably the most common question I think I have received in the last 8 years of my reporting. Where does the money come from? And the answer is complicated. I think that for a lot of people, they want the narrative to be simplified. There's one evil person at the top leading it. There's one organization. These are members A through Z. And this is how it's all done. You have to really think of it as it's so diffused across quite wide networks and large numbers of people who are sympathetic and supportive of the ideology to the point where they support financially. So what I saw happen in 2020 and what I was able to document, for example, through where was the bail money coming from? I mean, it was in the millions, depending on the jurisdiction. I think it was 30 million that was raised in the state of Minnesota for the riot and arson and even murder suspects there, because the money was shared amongst quite a large pool of felony suspects. In Portland, there were hundreds of thousands that were raised, including the full amount for a person that was charged with attempted murder, and his bail was set at $2 million. And so 200,000 was raised. How's that raised? Well, a lot of it was done through things like GoFundMe, out completely in the open, not dark money, not Bitcoin or some other currency like that, on GoFundMe and on Venmo, Cash App, and even PayPal. the reaches of some of these networks is really huge. They have access to very large email listservs, social media accounts that are essentially operate as influencers. They blast out the link, go here, pay. Our comrade fighting for racial justice is accused of this and that. And people give. They have, and some of them give significant amounts. You have thousands of people contributing several $100s. You can raise a lot of money, So that is how a lot of the immediate cash came in. Now, where higher levels of sourcing of funding come from, that flows through many of the registered nonprofits, many of them who actually receive state funding. As charities that apply for so-called charities, let's just say, that apply for grants through the state and then get approved for funding. And that, I would argue, is more so part of the one step back support network, like the legal aid groups that operate entirely to act as criminal defense for violent Antifa felony suspects. They have the money, they get funding from the state, they have some name like Civil Rights and Liberties Center, something that sounds really, really nice until you go on their social media and their website and you see, what they're actually advocating for and what clients they take. So that in those sources of funding, you can see it comes often from taxpayers. And another thing that is adjacent to the funding or money question, rather, is that rioters and violent suspects on the left are actually encouraged to be violent because there are these networks of attorneys who are immediately available to file civil lawsuits against police departments in cities claiming police brutality anytime police respond to some of these riot cases. In fact, they're soliciting clients right now, potential clients, in the ongoing insurrection in Portland against the ICE facility. People here don't know that for months now, there's been nightly violence and attacks on that federal government property in Southwest Portland. And they put out this call, and it's been dispersed to their far left networks that includes not just Antifa, but open borders groups, pro-Gaza groups. So like the networks are interlinked and they have immense reach. And so when they sue these police departments and cities, and we've seen it over and over, or reported on it, cities like LA, New York, Philadelphia, Portland, they'll just settle for the tens of millions. They won't go to trial. I don't know why. Maybe they just think that it's easier to pay out. It's public money. So they pay. And so some of these riot suspects who were arrested and had allegedly committed quite violent criminal acts end up getting millions in settlement.
Wow. Andy, you said a moment ago that these organizations, these nonprofits, they have these names that would lend one to believe that they have great missions, right? That they're advocating for justice, right? And I think with the Antifa movement, what consistently strikes me is that it provides this like caricature of being anti-fascist, right? But they're actually the ones who are trying to shut down all debate and trying to injure people who dissent from them. It's very fascist movement, it seems like, in its own right. But this ideology, it seems, I'm an outsider perspective. I've not been in the autonomous zones like you have, but it seems like there's this ideology that seems to kind of be shifting at times. And then also there seems to be this growing overlap between trans ideology and maybe some people who are particularly more vulnerable within society who are becoming radicalized through this ideology and this network. What are your thoughts?
Antifa is intentionally deceptive in its ideology. On the one hand, they want the public to believe, and this is where the role of the mainstream media is very important to them for this, they want enough of the public to believe that they are racial justice activists. You see them referred to as that in the press, as anti-racist protesters, social justice protesters, and anti-fascist protesters. So when you have a liberal woman, middle class in Portland who hears that, believes it, reads it in the New York Times and the Washington Post, the Oregonian in the case of Portland. Yeah, I'm on board with that. I'm against Trump. I'm against fascism. I'm against racism. I'm against hate speech. I'm going to go out and support them. I'm going to share their articles, their messaging. I'm going to encourage other people to do that. And that's one big layer of support that exists. And it's a symbiotic relationship because those people are also simultaneously radicalized. They don't realize it. And you can see it actually now in the data, some of this research that's coming out on surveying what people who identify as leftist center view about assassinations. I mean, according to a study at one research group at Rutgers, they found that over 50% found it would be at least somewhat justifiable to assassinate President Trump. That's a very large amount of number. We've seen anecdotally this onslaught of celebrations of the assassination of Charlie Kirk, not just reveling in his brutal murder, but suggesting that they hope other people get taken out, other people like him are silenced. And actually, what we're learning now through the new updated criminal complaint from the district attorney's office in Utah County, echoing some of the exact same language and writing that the accused gunman allegedly wrote to his transgender lover in regards to Charlie Kirk. And so the trans angle. So Antifa's ideology and the way it has salience is context specific. How they organize in Germany, for example, or in France, is the messaging around it is different than the American context. So over a decade ago, many years ago, they were much more about opposing international banking. So they would attack anytime there were these internationalist conferences that happened in the US, Occupy Wall Street, that type of movement is what they latched onto. And they existed on the fringes for that. That doesn't have quite big salience to the population. But then BLM came along. And that did have massive amplification from media propaganda, and it appealed to a lot of people. And so then that was the shift in focus, that we have an incoming Trump administration after 2016, and we have the focus on Black lives. So for the next 5 years, that was the focus. BLM has had a number of scandals internationally, not just in the US, particularly around alleged misuse of money. And they had so much money poured into them. So now the twist, the next evolution, if you want to call it, for Antifa has been latching on to trans radicalism. Trans extremism is sort of a parallel ideology, but they've kind of really merged together. The language of the trans activists now is they say they're fighting fascists in the government, fascist Christians. That's their language. And they aren't shy about any of their threats. If you talk to women's rights activists, as I've done many times, you go to any of the trans rallies, you see the signs and placards that they bring and what they chant. They call for women activists who are critical of their agenda to be killed. They wear shirts and signs that say things like trans rights or else, and then there are pictures of rifles and semi-automatic rifles and shotguns and other weapons. The lieutenant governor in Minnesota State, a Democrat, she wore a shirt to a press conference celebrating the passing of certain pro-trans legislation in Minnesota. Her shirt said, "Protect trans kids," and then there's an image of a knife. So that's the messaging in the mainstream. And this agenda of violent left-wing revolution for trans rights matches enough. There's some overlap with some of the Antifa agenda. So this sort of merging of the two ideologies, I've come up with the term, I call it Trantifa, that it's the two concentric circles have so much overlap now that it's almost one movement. And I saw that 5 years ago in the arrest data set. People might remember I was releasing all these mugshots, took a lot of work. So I was doing public records requests for every individual one. There were hundreds just in Portland. And then I would look into the backgrounds, and I found that up to 30% on any given night of a riot where there were dozens of arrestees, that the individuals were somehow gender diverse. And I use that to describe people who identify as trans or non-binary or some other neo-pronoun, like that whole umbrella. And 30% that's magnitude higher than all the estimates from experts that they have on the trans population. I think the estimate out of the UCLA study was 0.5%, which is already quite higher than other prior studies on it. But comparing 0.5% to 30%, look at the magnitude and difference. So there is this radicalizing effect we can see on trans people, and they view themselves as opposing fascism. And I am keeping a very close eye on the FBI investigation into the Charlie Kirk assassination. I think from reporting that I've read, one angle that they are probing is if the accused gunman was motivated by somehow feeling like he needed to respond to trans rights being under attack. And the alleged communications that were put out in the criminal complaint seem to suggest that. And his family has also told investigators allegedly that in recent years he had been more radicalized to the left, and particularly on issues around queer and trans.
So, Andy, the Center for American Liberty represents a number of parents right now, parents whose kids have been socially transitioned in schools. We also represent detransitioners in lawsuits against gender clinics and some very woke doctors that profited off of amputating healthy body parts. But as we kind of close up our conversation right now, I want to ask you if you have any advice for parents, because I think there seems to be this like pipeline, right? Maybe it starts in social media. You see a lot of this pipeline advancement, maybe in schools that are employing parental secrecy policies where it really feels cult-like, right? Like they're giving these kids a new identity, a new name. They're creating separation between these kids and their family support units and creating dependence on school officials. And then they're fomenting all of this misinformation, this propaganda in these kids' minds. So if you're talking to a parent who is wanting to do their best to protect their kids, what do you say to that parent?
So what I've seen through my reporting on some of the trans Antifa suspects and convicts over the years, ones who are particularly young, who have recently taken on a transgender identity, sometimes I go back just a few years and you see at some point in the recent past, they looked like they came from happy nuclear families. And the indoctrination of trans and leftist ideology seems to happen really only in two places for young people. It's on the internet and in public education, or even private education. I don't have to limit it to public. So many very expensive private educational institutions are the ones at the forefront of propagating these lies and propaganda. So it's those two places. Going back to the accused gunman in the Charlie Kirk assassination, the left were focusing on the fact that his parents were conservative, and as if to suggest that he was somehow motivated by MAGA. That was a lie in the suggestion that some media were reporting out. And then some influencers were actually outright lying and saying that So he was brought up in a conservative state and area, a very high number of Mormons, Latter-day Saints in the area that he was living in, St. George. And his father, according to reports, and I think it's also mentioned maybe in the criminal complaint, is that the father was a supporter of Donald Trump. And so, like, that was the family that this accused gunman, who's by all accounts quite left-wing, came from. And some of the most radical extremists that I've reported on have been people who come from conservative families. It's like, and I think it demonstrates sort of the reach of what's available online and out of the control quite often of parents, particularly when you have a teenager, a child, you can control tablet time and things like that. Somebody who's in high school, it's this is the a Sisyphean task, and it seems like there aren't really many good answers. I think what they can do is just to become aware that this stuff is out there. I think a lot of the culture has shifted so quickly on trans. I remember I think I've spoken to a lot of parents who had even no idea what any of this stuff was, because a lot of it's jargon, it's really online. They had no idea this stuff was being systematically put into the minds of their children. So you have to become aware and speak to your children, and don't let them get isolated online. I do reporting now on mass shooters. Some of them happen to be trans, and it's like what you see all the time is they're online. They're on Discord, which is also part of the story that's emerging about this Charlie Kirk assassin suspect. In other places, or they were on Tumblr or other places. There's so much wickedness online that is targeting vulnerable people and children.
Yeah. Andy, I want to thank you for taking the time today to share with us your expertise. It's been really enlightening for me to hear, and I'm confident that those viewing on social media and on our website have learned a lot from this conversation as well. So thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.